Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back from your break. Welcome back to all of you who have been watching this session online. You have already been provided with some questions so that they can serve as a basis for discussion. Now we can ask ourselves, how can Austria's path to European climate neutrality look like? We have questions relating to the paper to Professor Wells, and the question was asking whether we are on the right train or whether this train is moving into the right direction. We were given some contributions, some proposals in the area of socio-economy as to how we can completely transform our economic system and our economic understanding. And now we have a whole round of panelists, and we would like to look at these questions in depth. Now I would like to ask forward Professor Harald Welz. He's the representative of research. You are going to be given the middle seat. Then Dr. Helmut Hojesky, you heard him before. He is working for the Federal Ministry of Climate Protection. He's working there for environment and energy and mobility. This is your seat, please, Professor. And for the political aspects, we have our state secretary. This is your seat, please. But this is not it. We still have some very important representatives who are going to join us here on stage. Andreas Wolter, the president of the Climate Alliance and mayor of the city of Cologne. So to my right, please, and Norbert Reiner from the Climate Alliance Upper Austria. You see next to Andreas Wolter, and you may ask yourself now, who is going to sit here in the middle? That is for the lady in our round. That is Inge Hebel. She is responsible for sustainability for the furniture company Halli. I would like to ask you to help yourselves to the drinks that you would like to have. It's quite easy. I would like to start with you, Dr. Hojesky. For many, many years, you have been dealing with climate policies. You negotiate on behalf of Austria when it comes to setting new climate alliances. You are very well familiar with the European Green Deal. Now, what is your opinion about further steps to be taken? Steps to be taken since 2019, or the ones that have already been taken? And maybe another question: has the comment of Professor Welz, the comment of Mrs. Stadl, have those statements been included? I don't think you need to do anything there. Okay, maybe we have a look at the Green Deal first of all, because this is really the flagship of the new European Commission. What is important for me, and I want to emphasize it here, the European representatives of governments have actually corroborated the importance of this report, Climate Quality of 2020, the revised EU goal for 2030, minus 55% in terms of reduction as far as emissions are concerned. So lots of things have happened, and mid-July 2021, the first part of the package Fit for 55 was introduced with a lot of new approaches that starts with a mechanism, a cross-border mechanism. There is a proposition as to extend the emission trade to include buildings and the traffic. Of course, those two have to contribute further to reaching the EU targets. As far as energy efficiency is concerned, we have renewable goals that we have included. that relate to kerosene, sustainable productions, and it includes the maritime transport. So this is really a very comprehensive package. But I must say that will take some time to implement because they just started with the negotiations about it, and the speeds will be different, of course. So CO2 standards for cars. I think this is something that will quickly be implemented to as far as combustion engines are concerned, and I think there will still be discussions about replacing combustion engines, and I think a lot of automotive producers already have the same goal. Maybe that can be implemented slightly quicker, and the timeline, well, I think 2 to 2.5 years. It is something that has to be agreed about in the Council. We have 21 member states, so you have to negotiate with the European Parliament, and I think there will be a lot of pressure as far as higher ambitions are concerned, and this is really important. It has always been the case, and until it is actually been revised and completed, that will take a long time. But very important is that there are new approaches, and that what we have heard this morning, well, some of the aspects have been included, but a lot of the aspects mentioned have not been included. I have to admit, Professor Stadler and you, Mr. Professor, you said the same thing, this transformation which we need. We do need the transformation of society, and this is something which has not really been initiated. There are new proposals, and these new proposals are being heard. That is beginning. But of course, the large transformation has to come from the base. It is something that has to be supported by the population. So pricing, different pricings for CO2, is that an important topic? Well, that is part of the transporter mechanism. Then taxation on energies, that is a directive that is also included. I think it would be good if it could be spread across the whole of the EU countries. But very important is the eco-social tax, which is being discussed intensively within the coalition. That is very important. And some countries, as you have mentioned before, have shown this is something that actually works. And I hope that we will have a major breakthrough next year. What is important for us is that emission gases, CO or CO2, anything that damages the climate is something that needs to be priced higher. We need something to make up for that. Of course, for the higher prices, maybe you can simply charge less for additional costs. That is possible. There are different mechanisms. But of course, that will hopefully make people rethink and hopefully change our style of life. So if I interpret you correctly, then you say, well, as far as fundamental questions are concerned, how do we want to run our economies? How do we want to live? And we really need the pressure from the population, and that's not yet there. Yes, pressure, and of course the determination, because you have to convince people that this is something that you have to do. I think the awareness is there. That is something that is there. But if you ask an individual, what do you want to contribute personally? Then, of course, the situation changes. One question about the European balance mechanism. We talk about 27 countries, and in the Green we said, well, we have to do things in a socially compatible manner, and the different countries work at different speeds and the different effects as far as pricing CO2 emissions or other emissions. How does this look inside the 27 countries?
Well, it's quite varied, of course. So there's a couple of suggestions. There's a climate social fund where there's the income from the CO2 certificate trade, for example, that goes into, and other mobilization funds to support poorer countries, and for that to be socially supported as well. But there are instruments, and they have more funding than before. Mr. Volter, you mentioned in your initial comments what you've just recently witnessed in your region. You know the Climate Alliance quite well. You know the Green Deal quite well. If we look at everything that's happening at the moment, is this something that's going to be helpful for you, or is this something that will address the problems that you described? Yes, absolutely. I think it's an interdependency between the measures that are to be implemented. Obviously, we're developing measures here and there in transportation, for example, in houses, emissions from housing, and so on. And just because you mentioned, I have made the experience, as like you say, and I think people need to be convinced a lot in society, but also in politics. If we look at the floods again, people were looking at the floods. They at 5 o'clock, and they said this is not something that we've seen before. And then people didn't believe them when an hour later they were warned to leave their parts of towns. They just took the things from the ground and put them onto the cupboards and so on. And suddenly there was more and more water coming in waves, and it was a water high point of 3 meters 60, and they were told that they'd get levels of 5 meters, and at 9 o'clock in the evening they had 9 meters. So the amount of water that was coming towards them, people didn't realize, people didn't accept. And if you just put your head in the sand, then that's not very helpful. These things are already happening. Things it's if you look at these floods, then that's something that happened, and then we have a corona pandemic, and if these things happen more and more, then it will become much more palpable for people. Okay, but if you say, what do we need? We need maybe better technical solutions. We need dams. We need better infrastructure, better protected infrastructure, do you say? Or is this experience something that goes towards what Professor Welzer says? We need to rethink everything. The technical solutions only help in a limited manner. In Cologne, if suddenly we have flood waters of 10 meters, then, and that has happened before, then we have protection for like 13 meters, but at some point the water will not just go over the dam, but it'll come from the sides and from the other side as well. So a dam or a wall won't secure you forever. And obviously certain things could be adapted. You could rebuild certain things. But it's like a marathon, essentially. If the EU says, I think it's quite ambitious what the EU wants to achieve. 2 degrees, for example, is still quite ambitious. We really need to do a lot. It's going to be expensive. It will mean limitations for citizens and for communities. But we've also seen that the damages that climate change brings, they are clearly more expensive than what we have to spend to mitigate this. And like I say, it's not enough to just have your head in the sand, because at some point this will affect Austria as well. The Alps won't protect us for against all natural catastrophes. And then we'd assume that you would also be faced with similar problems. So I think drastic measures are needed in order to prevent these things, and that's something that really is expensive. It's not for free. You can have great measures from wild bees and all sorts of things that you can do. It doesn't. It really means we have to also speak to industry leaders. We have to look at e-mobility. Of course, an car is also a car still. So we have to look at how people behave, really. Big cities already do that, but we really need to start thinking differently in our modern world and the modern way that we work. In Cologne, every morning, some 950,000 people go to work every day. And a lot of them do it by car. And okay, well, so now they can't take public transport and motorways are broken. And so it's quite difficult. Our Dutch friends who come over to ski, the A61 will be difficult to take in direction of Austria, for example. I don't assume that it will be fixed by the next ski season, for example. So it's something that we see at the moment. So now you're touching on a couple of points. But what would you start, maybe 3 points that you would start immediately on your local level? Well, from my city perspective, if I speak as a person from Cologne, transportation, traffic is definitely a topic. We need a change in behavior. The European Regional Fund has to be extended quite significantly for that. And then the other question is, how do we create energy? Right next to the cathedral in Cologne, we have a coal power station that's very dirty. We need to renovate buildings to be less emission heavy. There's lots of points from the Green Deal that we can start. And then for the Climate Alliance, as well as for all the local networks, we need to be included in decision-making processes. It's not possible for us just to be part of consultations and so on, that we are heard. It's necessary that we decide as well. And it's not okay that a lot of the work is just done by consultants in Brussels, because if we look at the details, for example, in Austria, you want like local structures. What do you mean for what political status would you like? Well, we'd like to be at the negotiation tables, not just for climate change, but also for other questions like the refugee crisis. We did a lot of the work. A lot of citizens did a lot of the work in those areas. We know what's going on locally. We know the problems. Obviously, politicians in Brussels know that as well. But we are very directly confronted with these situations. And there's a lot of experience that we have. And especially as municipality or as local alliances, it's something where we can be part and need to be part of the decision-making process. Professor Welz, how is that something that comes closer to your opinion? Well, it is. Both of the people who spoke before me are coming towards my opinion, but I think the dimension is something that you can also make quite clear. So if you say a change has to be affected from the bottom up as well, so that's a good point, but where should it stem from? We don't really have a positive narrative about the climate neutral and just society. If you turn the TV on, for example, or if you're in social networks, people are always being pulled into consuming, into buying, and that's something that escalates. And so in Berlin, there's delivery services that promise to deliver something in 10 minutes. You might call them, I need a kilogram of flour, I need 3 tomatoes and something else, and someone is at your doorstep in 10 minutes and has delivered it to you. That's crazy. It's mad. It's just no other way to put it, because to have that kind of requirement or that kind of necessity 10 years ago, that's something you couldn't have imagined. How do you even fathom that you might need something within 10 minutes? What's the point? But it's a culture of absolute necessity. You create the necessity. You don't have this necessity via Facebook or others, you are infused with this necessity, and then before you even think about whether it's actually a requirement you already have the package. You don't even have time to think about that. You're so confronted with consumerism, and then at the same time you're being told that you're happy because you have something, or maybe you have a bit more, or something's a bit shorter, a bit quicker, a bit of a new innovation here and there. But Professor Welzer, who will give us a new narrative in that case? Well, that's us, I think. I think that's our responsibility. We, let's say, the people who are sitting here, it's our job to look at this fixation and the technological information reduction. We need to remove ourselves from that. And for example, you say the city can be very different. Rural areas can be very different. If we have never learnt about this, but suddenly a home office is very possible, we should be talking about how that contributes to our way of life. If there's a different model of life, then there's maybe less commuting that you do, then there's less CO2 emissions, for example, and we can have a reevaluation and a positive evaluation of rural areas, for example, if we have that different narrative. So the grand task really is to stand in competition to these consumerist ideas. And everyone who's somehow involved in a sustainability scene, you know that the sustainability scene doesn't really have a very good narrative, except that we're limiting ourselves somehow, but it's not a very good story. And people say, I don't want to make an effort, I want to have something nice, something better, so they might book a cruise trip, or they might buy a new car. So in that sense, it's very important. And the other thing is that we need to become more visionary. We don't have any narrative about the next society that we want to become or that we want to live. So questions of motivation, for example, we seem to be very linked to the topic of climate, and the entire EU is refusing to touch this topic, but we will have climate refugees in the next 15, 20 years. And that's something that you can't just shy away from. You need to look at these things proactively and not just try to stem everything that's coming towards you. But for an aging society, that could be quite positive, of course, a positive challenge. Maybe I can just link to that and then connect to Herr Wolter, and you speak quite a lot about how societies work and how the narratives can be. And you say that it is already quite complex on a European level, how it's complex how to get minimal agreements. And now your colleague here says they'd like to be part of the discussion. So we would like additional participation models. And with these complex participation models, is that something that will help us, or will we break on this? Well, it's two different areas. So one thing is professional activities. So it's the professionals in the area talking about climate change areas, but in the real world, nobody understands it. So there's a world full of acronyms, there's special terms, and so on. I was a member of the Council of Sustainable Development, and at the first meeting I said, I don't understand a word of what we're talking about. Do you think that anyone in the real world is going to understand what you're talking about? I think it's quite removed from the real world. All these mechanisms, I think 85% of people, if you tell them about mechanisms in climate change context, they don't really know what that's about. They might just understand why fossil fuels and petrol is becoming more expensive. If you talk about mechanisms, they might say, what are you talking about? And if you're lucky, they might approve. But there seems to be a huge distance between the professional activity, and it has to be professionalized, of course. We mustn't mistake this with like regular people. They have other problems in their everyday life. They can't be so informed and so up to date. But I think there can just be a lot simpler narratives. If you look at your own families, you look at how families have grown up, they didn't need 70 square meters per person to live in and 3 cars. Back in the day, you just have that relativity that at the core of our self-definition, of our self-image, you have the idea that our children shouldn't have it worse than we do. So that's a connection that people can understand. It's very simple to say something like that. It's very basic. If you look at how people are cared for who are about to die and what people think about when they're about to die, nobody thinks, oh, I would have loved to have the update for my newest Apple phone or something like that. No one says that. Or I would have enjoyed having the Audi Q8 and not just the A7, for example. They don't say these things. They say things like, I would have liked to have cared for my son a little bit more, or maybe my marriage broke up and that's a shame. So they speak about relations, and relations are something that is very important for us as humans, and that's something that you can link narratives to. And so you can link narratives like my colleague has spoken about. In his region, a lot was destroyed, not just in physical destruction, but human relations and stuff was destroyed. So that's something that you can connect with.
Frau Hebel.
Frau Hebel, Miss Hebel, as a company representative, you're a sustainability officer in a company. We've heard a lot of skepsis about the situation in the economy. How do you see it in your company? How do you see climate neutrality and the topic of the European New Deal? How is that for you? Okay, well, that's a lot of questions in one. Where should I start? Maybe I can talk about how this topic started in our company. So initially, the idea was not just to have an intrinsically motivated sustainability process. We produce office furniture, and it's a very comparable. We have a very comparable product. And we thought we can tell a story, we can have our own narrative if we produce sustainably. And it's something that was received quite positively and is noticed more and more. And then some 6.5 years ago, I joined the company, and I would say a lot of people thought, wow, this is a lot more than we were going for. We're already trying to be sustainable. Maybe this is enough. And there's a lot of things that I think you also mentioned. The idea that you have to grow as a company, and a lot of areas, a lot of us have an intrinsic idea, an intrinsic will to do something for to act sustainably as a company, or no, as a private person, as an individual, and as a company. I think we are looking at life cycle management in our company, and that if we get, for example, if we receive returns of furniture, but the furniture still works well, it still costs us a lot more to test the quality of a tabletop, for example, than to just buy a new one. So, and yes, we buy the tabletops in Austria. It's a chipboard tabletop. So where is it so difficult? Where is it that you say it's made hard for you? Well, so the CO2 emissions have a cost. It's not a lot, but you mean transportation costs mainly, or? Yes, CO2 in transportation costs, logistics, and also the creation of the material. So aluminium, for example, is a lot cheaper than recycled aluminium, for example. But we still work on these topics. So we have a lot of initiatives that we started, and
LED-Licht haben wir übrigens auch hier noch kurz eingeworfen. Bitte.
And next week we have a workshop with it's a funded project where we are inviting people to practice sustainability with us. So your furniture, your office furniture, you say it's quite a comparable product, and you mean that in an international competition context? Yes. So how do you see the European Green Deal internationally, especially if nationally the CO2 prices are created? Then we would assume you'd sell your products in Vienna maybe, but not in Shanghai. Well, certain instruments were mentioned, how CO2 emissions could be made, could be set off or could be balanced out with various initiatives. It's not a problem that is not solvable. It's a solvable problem, but if we as the EU or as Austria, we can't close ourselves off. It has to be something that other people would be happy to join in with. Yeah, maybe I can just lift this up. It's the FAR network. Okay, so you've started a narrative dynamic. How's your experience if you're the head of a company, and how do you come to this narrative? I think the easiest thing is that I always thought you have to argue factually, and I always looked at the tons of CO2 emitted and from what time to what time, and then we have a very young marketing officer, marketing manager, and she says that it's not very helpful. She doesn't really understand that approach, and now we present a lot more stories that are a lot more fun, and it really shows that we have these projects that people couldn't really notice. If there's a change in the glue product that we have, then it's noticeable. It's better for the environment. It's better for the people who work with it, for example. And those projects, we have a lot of these projects. So you work on very concrete areas of your production. How could you be more climate neutral in this area or that area? That's your approach, I understand. Yes, so we look at doing this not only in production, but in the whole value chain. Where do we buy, where do we produce, and what distribution channels do we use? We've heard a couple of times then where that there's not a lot of role models for these areas, or would you say? Well, I'm not sure. I think in the environmental area, there's women on an international level that are still out there, that still put their voices forward in difficult areas for environmental issues. And it used to be quite hard in Austria as well, but now there's more and more support. The federal councillor, I think, will speak a little bit more about these political things. I'd like to use the opportunity to ferment this dialogue a little bit more with Mr. Reiner. With the Austrian Climate Alliance, if we look at these large buzzwords, if these large topics, if we look at logistic measures, for example, that make things more controllable, where do you think are the main points, the main focal points for the Climate Alliance? Does the Green Deal give us new conditions, new tools that we can use in our context, especially for the context of Austria?
Danke dem Herrn Welzer fürs part digression.
Thanks, Mr. Welzer, for his comments. I think it's quite important because the Green Deal has really defined our goals very clearly. We have the framework, which is very clearly defined as well, but I think the decisive thing in the next couple of years will be the storytelling, or the stories. And when I joined Climate Alliance 15 years ago, I had the feeling it's a little bit of a CO2 tonnage club, and it's that focus that was a bit exaggerated. It's not only about, or it's not so much about the CO2 emissions, it's about telling stories. And it's something that I'm quite self-critical as well, especially in the scene of NGOs and others. They have this vision and narrative of dystopias, and it's a terrible situation that you've had in Germany, but we need to flip the story towards utopias. I think utopias can help us if we look at in a very local context, how things can work in a local community setting. You gain in life quality. I'm not talking about standards so much. It's not so much about the narrative of growing life quality or the spirituality of growth. I think we could improve a lot of things. We could improve our relations. If we speak about growth, then it should be growth in the right areas, not just economic growth. And in communities where you have bus shuttles that help the vulnerable people to reach their doctor's practices safely, then that's life quality, and it's good, it's positive, and it's an extremely high value for the people in that community. Then maybe you have a car sharing system, 5 or 6, 10 houses that have a car sharing agreement. Then that's something that you can economize on. If there's a good transport system in the city, if cars become quality of life. And that's why I believe that the Climate Alliance, especially with the federal system, I've been working together with them for ages now, and we try to tell these stories, we try to make them very palpable, very understandable. They have to be local. It starts now maybe new with the Green Deal. It's something that is influencing us again, but we are allowed to tell new stories.
I heard in the initial statement from our Lord Mayor and from others that what is important is also the legal framework now. What do we do about that? And there's also the finance. Now, what is actually being subsidized? Now, these are really the incentive systems that are in place. And when you look at what has been achieved so far within the context of the European Green Deal, do you think that these things have been incorporated? They have something to do with life quality. You don't get something for nothing. We know those topics. We know people talk about mobility. People talk about the rehabilitation of buildings. They talk about free networks. Now, is there an emphasis on this? Will it be made easier for the municipalities to do something there in those areas? Yes, because I need to add something. You said something has been accepted, but there's still the narrative, the rehabilitation rates are around about 1%, not 3%, because people tell us we want to save energy and we want to reduce CO2 emissions, and nobody says, well, it's much more comfortable to live in a building where you don't have the draft, where you don't get the back pain because of that, because you're close to the window. And that is something that I want to emphasize. We simply have to change our narrative, and the Green Deal has to point out these targets. I'm really so happy that the European Union now has a very, very clearly defined targets up to 2030, and they are going to be implemented on a regional level. And this is why the Climate Alliance is a very interesting project. For many, many years, we have been developing projects and have subjected them to approval, and always had the hope that they may be subsidized. And now we do have the funds available in the market. There's something like a competition there for the subsidies. There's the Climate Alliance. Now we have new players in the market. You have we had only consultants, and they're still there. They just need quick money. That's all that they can see. So we must make sure that these billions are available for the right projects. And so far as the municipalities in Austria as a whole country is concerned, I'm very, very positive. I'm very optimistic. Please don't let me know that there's no funds there. We do have enough funds. The funds just have to be used in the proper fashion. For example, we can renovate roads, for example, but only because you get your jab quicker or not. Okay, now. State Secretary, I think there was something included where you would have liked to add something, add some short comment as a politician, I think. Well, for me, a very, very interesting topic, important topic here is something that we heard about earlier, is the definition of the economy which takes priority, and this is something which prevails in our way of thinking. Another question is, now what do we get in terms of subsidies? What kind of project do we have to implement, and what kind of subsidies do we get for that project? So this is also a way of thinking in economic terms all the time. I know as a politician you want to win elections, or you should win elections. We now are talking about a topic that has been implemented in the long run. There's a lot of fear. We heard that today, for example, if there's a weakening of the industry because of the European Green Deal, then we will have a much, much larger problem, just a different problem. So what actually is it that you think can be achieved realistically on a local level? There were so many interesting elements that I simply cannot answer to all of them. It's something that's going on in my head at the moment, and that started with the presentation of Professor Welzer. There is such an academic, sometimes a psychological discourse about what the real world should look like, how it could work, and how we can continue to develop capitalism, and how could our economic way of thinking work properly. Under which premises I dealt with these questions. I never dealt with these questions before, and I must say that is something that is so far away from the things I have to deal with daily, and we really have to try to find the right answers so that we can pull people together, can make them support us, because we are in a society which thrives on consumption, and we want something else, and you are somewhere in between. And as a politician in between, you have to make a decision, and you have to make a decision which shows that the train goes in the right direction, away from ultra-capitalist consumption, away from this consumptive society to another society. It's something that we are really thinking about a lot in Upper Austria, for example, that we need another approach for the harvesting of sun energy. And everybody writes down what is allowed. Nobody says how it can be financed. Nobody says what kind of measures the government wants to implement. But the whole project has said what people, individuals have to do. And that is really not sufficient. It is simply not sufficient. What we have to do is to look at the finance that is available and have to direct it into the right channels. We can do a lot there, and we are achieving a lot on the federal level. But as I said before, there's always a danger when you talk about an ideal situation and how things are supposed to be, and then somebody who judges you think in terms of the old capitalist system and compare that to what you have done. But that's always easy to work within one old system and to envisage a new system, what the new system should be like. For example, there's a plan for renewable energies with several billions that is in place, and something which is slightly revolutionary when it comes to transport and mobility is the climate ticket, which is going to be introduced in Austria. An Upper Austria commuter who has to travel 35 kilometers has to pay 1,400 euros a year for public transport from Haslach to Linz and from Linz to Haslach. And what she's going to be given in Austria is a ticket which is 550 euros cheaper. And she cannot only use it to commute to work, but she can also, any kind of transport, can use any kind of transport in her free time, in her leisure time, any kind of a transport that she wants, whether it's a train or a bicycle or a bus. And that is going to change things. It's going to change things fundamentally. And this is the goal we have defined. We said the costs for the public traffic has to be reduced. It has to be made in such a fashion that it costs actually money if somebody uses their car, and we have to create the network in such a fashion that somebody can dispense with a car. They no longer need a car. Now, if I now have a ticket and none of the public service modes costs anything, then maybe people will simply not buy any more cars because that will cost too much. May I say something about that aspect? Because we are not talking about the structure in Austria. We must say that we do not have that many urban centers. We have a lot of regional areas, and in those areas we have a functioning public transport. Then we will have the CO2 emissions, and the CO2 emissions will affect those who commute, because most of the commuters are not those in the high income category. Now, how can you support them? What can you do for them? Because we keep on having discussions about possible models that could be implemented, but they have never been implemented. Why have they not been accepted? Well, this is something that we are negotiating at the moment, and I can say it is not going to be a problem that there are not enough arguments for the commuter and for the car. What we have a problem with at the moment that we don't have enough tailwind for an effective CO2 pricing model. This is what we are working at the moment, and it's really a very interesting role that the industry and economy are taking on, because innovative companies will be very happy if the life cycle management would be supported, and if there would be a difference between a product which is being recycled and a product that is just thrown away. If it becomes difficult to send products to Shanghai, for example, then you have to ask yourself the question, does it make sense to sell products to Shanghai? And I can remember that we really had a very good development aid project that concerned a hospital in Africa. So Upper Austria subsidized the building of the hospital. That's great. And the equipment for that hospital came from Upper Austria. I'm not talking about high tech. I'm talking about seats, for example, and tables. And we noticed at the time how absurd this would be, because in Africa there's a lot of carpenters. They can do the same thing. They can build tables and chairs. So to have a different access to things which can be done on a local level have to be globalized, I think that's totally the wrong approach. That is something that we have to throw away. I know it is very difficult in our system, but I think this is really one of the major problems that we have. Okay, let's stick to the topic. Can we think differently when it comes to economy? Can we think of growth in different terms? Mr. Gruner, the state secretary, is a small player in Upper Austria. We do have a very strong industry, a very strong economy. Now, is there the possibility of communication, a level of communication where can discuss these topics? Like, for example, you from Halle, at least as a person, you're setting a good example. But when it comes to larger alliances, to larger organizations, is it possible to do so? Are they interested in communicating it, or do they simply say, okay, we will get more funds, we will grow, we will have more profit, everything's great? So,
Also im Sinne von Kohle, nicht politisch gesprochen, weil Schwarze gibt es ja gar keine mehr.
Well, for 1.5 years, I have been responsible for climate protection inside the government. And at some point, I noticed I went to the larger industries because I wanted to discuss this topic. And on the board level, they really understood that climate protection is something that is not going to go away. It's a global challenge and something that will come. And the question that these companies are asking themselves is an economic question, of course. How can I make money by implementing certain things? And how can I maybe be a leader in the technological field? And we have to create the framework conditions for that to happen. But of course, we always keep thinking in terms of trains of thought which may be overcome. So we talk about the fact, for example, how you can make a highly sophisticated processes in such a way that you have CO2 neutrality. What they don't discuss is how can we curb production, because we need to use wood more instead of steel and concrete, for example. There we know that these goals are much more difficult to achieve. Well, the way I see it, it is really a very difficult topic, because we have to work within the structures that are in existence, also the thought processes of those in charge. And the prevailing opinion is that they have to think about economic growth, that they want to be successful inside a country, and that also has social effects. Because things like jobs, creating new jobs, and to create more social stability, it comes also into play. So it all means that we have to get away from this capitalist wealth structure. But these are the first steps that need to be taken. And what makes it easier, if, for example, we implement CO2 pricing systems, that is something that has to be done in an honest fashion, because then people start to rethink, and then it becomes more interesting for people to change their way of life, to look for more greener spaces, at least where people live. And then there is the hope that people will finally completely change their way of thinking. We all have to contribute to that. We have to make sure that the basic structures of economic thinking will be changed. Okay, one more question for this first round. At the beginning, we spoke with Mr. Hojesky and said that political opinion is very important. In the 90s and 80s, we had the pressure groups. He had a completely different narrative. If you look at what happens these days, because of the involvement of the government, people have to take a more pragmatic approach, and negotiations are much more difficult. Now, where do you see the groups
tragfähige Erzählung haben und
who
gesagt, aus meiner Sicht sind
can
Fridays for
be
Future
considered as important partners. Fridays for Future movement, for example, with their message of this is our future, we don't want to destroy our future. They are very important when it comes to the opinion in the current society. What do you think? I think as far as the climate is concerned, this is a very loud voice and a voice which is necessary. I think it's quite evident that the Green Party was founded as a thorn in the flesh of the powerful organization, as a progressive movement, which at the level of 7% tells every parliament what has to be done. And after 30 years, we noticed they're not going to do anything, they just talk. So we have to do it ourselves. And that will be done much quicker if we can take over responsibility as a government. And this is something that we will have to prove within the next 20 years. It is a challenge, of course, because to be given the majority vote in a democratic system is not an easy thing to achieve. We have the notion, there's the notion that climate protection is important. Everybody wants it, and all the measures that have been described here are really good, and they will help us to become climate neutral, and they are accepted, they will be accepted by everybody, but that is not the case. Well, the main argument also for the next generation is to preserve a livable planet. That is a very important argument. My children will live up to 2100, and I've got so much to do with climate researchers, and I know exactly what will happen if you don't do anything about climate change. Now, of course, we have to be concerned about the next generations. That's a moral dimension which we have to live up to. But in addition, there's the quality of life, and that concerns clean air in our cities, the question of getting quicker to work and not to be stuck in traffic for 1.5 hours before I arrive at the workplace. And then you have the issue of children that need to be looked after while you go to work. So it also has something to do with our quality of life, and it has also something to do with the fact that we should be able to sustain a crisis. Will we have something like a normal climate in summer in 20 years from now? Because so far, up to 500 years, we've always experienced this, and we're happy to do so. So thank you very much for listening to us. We are a large round, and I hope we were able to cover some of the aspects of this topic which you find interesting. I would like to ask you to take part in our discussion with some contributions or with questions. If you would please raise your hands. Mr. Elling, I think, is somewhere. He has a microphone. So if you would simply raise your hand, and for those of you who are online, would you please put your questions into the question-answer section? Mr. Nonnemann is going to give us your questions. Anything somebody wants to say? Ellinger, second or third row, I think it is. Yeah. I'm going to repeat the questions later, yeah, of course. Okay, just to summarize what you said, the question points to the transformation which is in the pipeline because of digital transformation, what effect it will have on jobs, transformation inside of a society, and what effect will it have on climate change? Okay, that was one question. Any more statements to be made? Any more questions?
Aus dem Publikum? Okay, das Wording.
Somebody has a question directed to Professor Welzer. What kind of terms are you supposed to use if you don't want to talk about climate crisis, if it refers to a change of condition? So we now need an answer, maybe.
Frau
Thunemann, do we have any questions online? At the beginning of the discussion, there were several contributions and different questions that have already been answered. Frau Wieser refers to Mrs. Stadl. I think that's a question that you can answer. What we need in Austria to make sure that universal social services will be implemented in Austria. Then another question from another participant. who understands how important the basic needs are, but because of the fact that people have to renounce certain things in order to be able to, to innovate things, she thinks that is really a goal which can only with difficulty be achieved because those who are rich will have to do without things as well. Malibagal asked about approaches for solutions to make sure that change from the root can be promoted, and of course it is very important to promote change from the basic, but of course it's very important that we also have a different narratives, which is important, and specifically when it comes to the Green Deal. Of course, it is a problem that the EU Green Deal is in place, but of course it has to consider the economic growth, and so there's still this lie. Really, it is a lie because the economic growth is not really considered, and nobody has to make a major decision is courageous enough to refer back to that and to see how difficult it is to achieve these goals in conjunction with economic goals, how we continue to grow, how can we achieve our goals, and how can we make sure that innovation is going to save us, and how can we make sure that those that are the decision makers and majority of the population, how can we make that they wake up? Then another statement, Mr. Grind said that against the background of what's happening today, don't we have to ask ourselves, is it not better to produce for the international market, or should we concentrate on the regional markets? And Mr. Welzer mentioned that as well, how we can possibly change the growth. That was another statement. And then two comments by Mr. Herzke. The approach should be to have a short narrative and to look at human relationships. He thinks is a very important approach, and to have a very strong socio-economic approach. Thank you very much. Now, Professor Stadl, I know you're not part of the panelists here. May I ask you to answer the economic questions? Mr. Ellerger, would you mind handing her the microphone, because the question is directed to the universal social services. That was a question for you, and how such a thing could be implemented. And basic income is also a question I think that you should answer. And during your paper, there was a question whether the social economy is something that is suitable as a tool for action. Would you mind answering this? As far as universal basic services are concerned, there are some very promising approaches which I have been noticing in Austria as far as education is concerned. Education should be free, that it is something that should be accessible for everybody who's got the required qualifications. And as far as buildings are concerned, there's a lot that's done. And then another thing which is very important is the climate ticket. That may be a game changer, and we need more of these approaches in different areas of need to satisfy the basic needs in a way that is accessible to everybody and which is not based on consumptive pattern. And as far as consumption goods are concerned, I think this would be the icing on the cake. And sometimes if we don't have the icing on the cake, it is not such a problem, because we still have a very good supply that makes us resilient and that gives us the room to maneuver. Now, the other questions as far as universal basic income, I think it was in the context of artificial intelligence. This is how I at least interpreted it. Well, the question whether digitization going to eliminate workplaces or creates jobs is something which has not yet been finally discussed, because there are different empirical answers. But I think it will lead to a change that is definite, and some professions will be affected that will really surprise us. For example, lawyers who deal with standard processes, and they are very good, but maybe this is something that can be taken over by computer algorithms. So these are high-paid jobs which will be affected by the change. Well, on the other hand, we will need more IT technicians. So there are different empirical conclusions, something which is very important in the context of artificial intelligence. At least I think that is that you do not create an unproductive class who depend on subsidies, but it would be better to reduce the working hours as a general project. That is something that should be propagated inside society. And if this is done well, I think it can create ecological advantages, but that really depends on what kind of shortening of working hours you introduce. There's a difference between shortening your working hours than your your working hours for a month or for a week. So if you have fewer working hours, you have a better quality of life. This is one of the research projects that we have at our university. Can you say something more about it? Well, the question, for example, the working hours, that is something. There are no real experiments already. There's a lot of ideas about it, but not really real projects, real experiments, because it's really interesting to find out how the shortening of working hours affect the ecological usage. And if it's the working hours that are reduced within the week, it means that weekends will be longer, and in combination with cheap flights, it is easily imaginable that it will lead to a higher ecological consumption. But if the daily working hours are shortened, I think that may lead to a better participation of all the members of the household. For example, there will be the household duties that will be changed, and there's more time to use a public transport to get to work and things like that. So the type of shortening of the working hours is very, very important for the ecological effects. But shortening the working hours is important, but as is the case with the CO2 pricing systems, it is not a panacea. Okay, once again, no panacea, but to have something which is very important, which covers several dimensions. Mr. Hojesky, don't we have enough research which can help us to make the right political or legal decisions? Yes and no. Of course, research is very important, especially when it comes to the economy and to society, because that helps to raise awareness better, that we have a good narrative. Climate communication is very important, and I think we have to do much more in that area in order to make sure that we have positive narratives. But at the same time, I must say, we know the measures, we know all the tools, we know the technical solutions for many areas, and they have been in place for 20, 40 years. But what is the problem is the implementation. Everything happens too slowly. And things are completely different in industry. There's still some research that is needed, of course, and a lot of things are being changed, and there's a lot of different initiatives. But I think the first step is that we simply have to implement everything that everybody knows about. Solar energy, for example, that has been around for many years and it's not expensive.
It reminds me of what the Catholic Church used to say. They were mentioning they had the Vatican Council for 50 years and they still needed to implement all of that. Well, there's so much funding. We've never had so much funding in these areas. That would have been another question of mine as well. So the amount of money, it's quite clear there's vast sums of money available, and some areas are thinking about how might they be able to deviate some of that money to have a good business model there as well. But in this area, how can we talk about being efficient in that area? Even local communities, municipalities can apply for those funds. It's something that is funded and supported, and there's various initiatives. The EU supports this. The financial framework shows that some 30% of funds should be used regionally, and the framework of the EU says the same. So there's so much money there for climate protection, but the funds have to go to the right areas, to the right people. Okay, maybe I can come back to Mr. Volter's point from earlier. We know, or we assume we know, how European decision-making processes take place and how lobbying takes place and how intense this is done. And then the feeling that we don't feel that we're very integrated. We're not very integrated in the democratic decision-making process. So what can we do in that context? Well, so that's not quite right. We are part of a lot of decision-making processes. So communities, local communities, municipalities. There's some 2,300 communities in Austria. We can't communicate with all of them, of course, but there are city networks, community networks, and they are listened to just the same. Mr. Volter, please. I think maybe we can react to that if you say, well, maybe now the municipalities want to join in there as well. You know, I think it's something where we have to go to Brussels as well to speak directly to them, not just via the various networks that we already have, just to sort of see what we can achieve. I think it's not just about agreeing on goals, it's that we have a lot of experience. I think me, and from like a German perspective, and I think a lot of other people see that you say there's a lot of money there, but of course a lot of it is already spent, and a lot of it is part of financing processes. Of course, there is a federal system here and there, and it's all very long term. So if we want to build a green tram system, then you're talking about 2030, 2035 when it might be operational. So just because the whole process is so long term, that the fact that we want to build it, maybe we agree, but then things are just left idle for a long time. And then the second point that I wanted to reiterate, we really need a good regulation of the value chain. So the ecological sustainability of raw materials, globally purchased maybe from China or other places. There's a lot of things, and I think we need to change our behavior in that area. It's not enough to receive our soybeans from Brazil, where deforestation has occurred, but we still class it as organic soybeans, for example, or the same stuff about behavior with driving cars. Maybe you can walk to work, maybe you can cycle to work. And so I think free trade, definitely, I'm definitely an advocate of free trade, but you also need certain standards that are enforceable. And then I think if you look at the Green Deal, all those funds, they have to go and be invested into changing the behavior of the population and less into technology. I think it's lovely to have e-cars, but in the end, even to produce them, they need resources, and they might come from terrible circumstances as well sometimes. I had understood your colleague's argument that these situations create a good narrative and a good attractive story that can be pulled forward. Professor Welzer, we need to come to a close. I'd like to let you all speak briefly. What shall we how should we talk about this topic? Maybe you can make some final points. I didn't know that my role was so important that I would have to decide on the exact wording. Well, you have 1 minute for some wording. I'd say, okay, I'd just say maybe it's heating of the planet, and maybe that helps with, you can just use that term as you like, the overheating of the planet. Okay, and then the socio-ecological question from the audience as well. It seems that wealthy people seem to be much harder convinced to change to alternative means of behavior or alternative areas. What can we do in that area? Well, it needs a correction, essentially. So we need to find a better argumentation, and it connects to what Mr. Volta was saying. If we have better methods, then behavior will change as well. So there's a research area called diffusion research, which measures lead to which results. And then maybe you can just say very simplistically that if you say to people, look at this diagram, that wouldn't lead to any change in behavior because other forces are much faster, much stronger. But if I show a very positive, well-working public transportation system like in Switzerland, then the amount of users will increase, not because they are thinking about climate change and so on, but it's because it's better, and then it's a secondary effect because it's good for climate change. So you need to create a better advantage, and in that case you can move away from arguing with analyses and so on. If you build better houses, for example, then you create good results, and everyone would say, okay, it's not about destroying these buildings and creating better ones. It's more, people understand that it's much less work to just renovate buildings and so on, and then the climate advantage is a secondary advantage. And I think it always seems very trivial to think about what story I can tell to get people on my side. That's always going to fail. The basic instincts and the basic interests are always something very direct. And if I think about what the group that I belong to, what would they want, what do they expect from me, and that will lead to something more successful. I think after this discussion, I think we can definitely say that we're in a transformational phase. Then we have touched on a lot of different points with metaphors, with measures being mentioned, with financial funding streams, with logistical measures. And if we look at how we might be able to steer this development, steering it is not so easy. It seems that we are active in the current system in order to enable a new system, and it's quite a challenge that we're all facing in that sense. And I believe that we have we've heard a lot of actionable measures, and maybe I can ask you for a very, very brief last statement, a round of last statements from what you've heard today, from what is in your mind today. What is most convincing to you in terms of next steps? We've spoken about Green Deal up until 2050, and that's quite long term. But what are the things that you think are most important as next steps? Councillor, please. I think we are at the beginning of a century of rail construction. We're talking about public transport for people to be able to get anywhere. We're trying to construct more with wood, and especially, and this is a challenge, of course, for adaptation to climate change, we are starting to depopulate areas. We have to stop cementing all the surface areas that we have. It's a very new discussion that we had at various trade associations, that we might tell them that you have to remove all the parking spaces to get rid of the cement. And that's something very new, a very sort of radical idea for trade associations. If you think about supermarkets and so on, they're always a little bit more rural, and that's still a problem. But we have to think about depopulating areas and removing cement from the surfaces. I think I can definitely agree with what my predecessor has said. And if we look at a CO2 price, that might be something that would help all the other areas as well. And if we speak about climate resilience, that's something that's very decisive. If we think about closing up earth and surface areas, it's topics of further canals and river areas. And if we talk about the Green Deal goals by 2050, yesterday there was a climate change report that was accepted, and it shows a very dramatic change. And I think these are the topics that we have to look at. It's not something that's going to go away. It's something that we might be able to mitigate. Thank you. Professor Welzer, please. Yes, well, I think the most powerful thing is that you have to show what's possible. If you look at the whole topic of city and city mobility, you can look at what Barcelona is doing and how they communicate it so well, or like what they do in Copenhagen or in Pontenegra in Spain. There's a lot of examples that are quite easily understandable. You're looking at life quality and innovation where things work together very well. And I think we need these examples, and these examples will take us away from these abstract acronyms. If you ask people how they're living, and they will tell you that they are living better than before. Thank you. Miss Hebel. What convinces me is quite clear, defined goals and consequences if you don't meet those goals. So something that the economy can count on, something that would create jobs. So clear definition of goals, and then if you look at the real cost of supply chain parts. And the third thing, I think, is communication. All the storytelling that we have, or back in the day, the sustainability chains, that's something that we didn't speak about, but now we notice that people are more and more interested in this topic. And if we talk about communication, it's very important to say it's not about the environment. The climate protection is a social issue, and there's a lot of people that are directly affected by these issues, and there's a lot of people who still believe they won't be affected by these developments. Thank you. Mr. Volta. Also, very important is that we need the implementation. The money is there, like you say. The money has to be spent and soon. Obviously, we are looking at the funds that come from the Green Deal. That has to be spent in the area of behavioral change, and that the true cost of certain things is actually represented in Cologne and in Austria. I think it's the same topics of it's the same topic of transportation costs. I think it's cheaper to transport crabs from the North Sea down to Austria, for example, and it seems unachievable. Well, what you spoke about is the century of rail travel, and for us, we can't really use rail travel anymore. We're using lorries much more, and it's just not possible otherwise, and the infrastructure just isn't there for that. That's something that has to be worked on before things get better. Okay, thank you, Mr. Walter. Herr Reiner, please. I think we're part of a process, and in this process, we're very integrated, and it's something that we have to be courageous about. We have to be very concrete in how we act. The real life costs are decreasing in Austria, and I think it's important to look at these things in the bigger picture, because if the real costs aren't represented, then it doesn't really help. I think we can say it's very important to be active. It's not, you can't achieve anything if you don't do anything. So being active, that shows a lot of strength, and I'd like to say the same to politicians or to politics. They need to be courageous, they need to be active, and we are looking towards a better world, even if it's a changed world. But I am very convinced that as a father for my daughters, I think something different might just be something better, and that's something that we can still define. But I'm very convinced that that's something that we will achieve for the betterment of humanity. Okay, thank you. That's a nice final word. Topic of renewable energy as well. Thank you everyone for your contributions. Thank you everyone who's been part of this online as well. We've had a very intense morning, and I think we've earned a break for lunch. Here you can get some food from the food trucks. You can eat with meat or without meat if you like. It's all regionally sourced and organic. If you are leaving us already, then please leave your name tags. Those will be reused for a next event. If you had a headset for translation, please hand that in as well. And we'd like to invite you all to take part for the afternoon session at 2 p.m. That will be here in this room. We'll be having the Climate Alliance Awards for the community awards, and you're very welcome to join for that. And if you are not part of that, then we look forward to seeing you at 9 a.m. tomorrow, and we'd like to wish you a nice day and see you soon. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dankeschön.